The wind tore across the valley like a blade made of ice, and Alara Whitfield heard the wolf before she saw him. It was not a howl. It was worse than a howl. It was a broken, ragged sound, half growl and half cry, coming from somewhere near the river bend where the water never fully froze even in the deepest winter. She stopped walking, her basket of frostbitten herbs swinging against her hip, and turned toward the sound with her heart already pounding. Nobody went near the river in this season. Everyone in Hollow Pine knew that. The current beneath the ice was fast and merciless, and every few winters it claimed someone who forgot to respect it. Alara's own uncle had lost 2 fingers to frostbite trying to pull a drowning goat from that same river when she was a child. She had grown up hearing warnings about it the way other children heard bedtime stories. But the sound came again, closer this time, more desperate, and something in her chest refused to let her walk away. She left the path. The snow was knee-deep in places, and her boots, old and patched at the toe, were not made for this kind of walking. Still, she pushed forward, following the sound through a stand of black pine trees whose branches sagged low under the weight of frost. The wind screamed through the gaps in the trees, and twice she nearly turned back, telling herself that whatever animal was out there was not her responsibility, that a healer's daughter had no business chasing danger into the wild on a night like this. But then she saw him. At first she thought it was a boulder, dark and massive against the white snow. Then it moved, and she realized with a jolt of fear and awe that she was looking at a wolf larger than any she had ever seen or heard of. His fur was the color of wet slate, streaked with silver along his spine, and his shoulders alone were taller than her waist. He stood on a jagged shelf of ice at the river's edge, his front paws braced against the frozen surface, his whole body trembling. Alara had grown up on stories of the great wolves, the bonded companions of the Alpha Kings who ruled the packs beyond the northern ridge. She had never expected to see one with her own eyes, and certainly not like this, trapped and terrified on breaking ice in the middle of a storm. The ice beneath him groaned, a deep cracking sound that echoed across the water like a warning. The wolf's ears flattened against his skull, and he let out that same broken cry she had heard from the trees. Alara understood then. He was not stuck. He was drowning slowly, inch by inch, as the ice beneath his paws splintered further with every passing second, and the black water of the river waited hungrily below. She had no rope. She had no help. She was a single young woman, standing at the edge of a frozen river, with nothing but a basket of herbs, and a heart that would not let her walk away.
"Hold still," she called out, though she doubted the wolf could understand her, and even if he could, she had no idea how to help him.
"Please, just hold still." The wind swallowed her words. The wolf's dark eyes found hers anyway, and for a moment, something passed between them that felt less like fear and more like recognition, as though the animal understood exactly how much danger they were both in. Alara scanned the riverbank desperately. There was an old fishing hut nestled among the pines, abandoned since autumn, when the fishermen moved their operations downstream to warmer waters. She had passed it 100 times without a second glance. Now she ran toward it, her lungs burning with cold air, her legs aching from pushing through the deep snow. The door of the hut was frozen shut, and she had to slam her shoulder against it twice before it gave way with a groan of old wood. Inside, the air was musty and still, filled with the smell of dried fish and tar. She searched frantically through crates and shelves, her hands shaking, until she found it, coiled in the corner beneath a torn fishing net. A single length of rope, thick, sturdy, clearly meant for hauling heavy nets from the water. It was not long, but it was strong, and it was the only thing in the hut that might save the wolf's life. She grabbed it and ran back out into the storm. By the time she reached the riverbank again, the ice beneath the wolf had cracked further. He had shifted position, trying desperately to find solid footing, but every movement seemed to weaken the fragile shelf beneath him. Water was beginning to seep up through new fractures, dark and gleaming in the fading light. Alara's mind raced. She was not strong enough to pull a wolf that size from the water if he fell in. She barely had the strength to hold her own weight against a strong current. If she threw the rope to him, and the ice gave way beneath her too, there would be no one left to save either of them. She thought of tying the rope around her own waist first, anchoring herself to a nearby tree before attempting the rescue. It was the safer choice, the choice her mother would have begged her to make, but there was no time. The wolf let out another cry, and this one was different, weaker. as though he was beginning to accept that the ice would not hold much longer. There was only one rope. She could use it to secure herself, or she could throw it to him. She could not do both. Alara did not remember deciding. Her body simply moved, her arms already swinging the rope in a wide arc, releasing it toward the wolf with every ounce of strength she had. The rope sailed through the freezing air, spinning end over end, and for one terrible second, she thought it would fall short and disappear into the black water. Then the wolf lunged, his powerful jaws snapping shut around the rope just as the ice beneath him gave way completely. The sound that followed would stay with Alara for the rest of her life, a deep splintering crack, followed by a violent splash, and then the wolf was in the water, thrashing, his massive body fighting against a current that seemed determined to pull him under. But he held the rope. Even as the cold water closed over his head, even as his strength began to fail, his jaws remained locked around the only thing tethering him to survival. Alara planted her feet in the snow and pulled with everything she had. It felt impossible. The wolf outweighed her many times over, and the current worked against her with a strength that made her arms scream in protest. She dug her heels into the frozen ground, wrapped the loose end of the rope around her forearm, and screamed through gritted teeth as she hauled backward, inch by agonizing inch. Slowly, impossibly, the wolf began to move toward the shore. His head broke the surface first, water streaming from his silver-streaked fur, his dark eyes wild with the shock of the cold. He kicked against the current, using what strength remained to help her pull him closer, until finally his front paws found the solid edge of the riverbank, and he hauled himself out of the water with a desperate, shuddering heave. He collapsed onto the snow, his enormous body shaking violently, water pooling around him in the fading light. Alara stumbled backward, her own arms trembling from the effort, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had done it. She had actually done it. Relief flooded through her, warm and dizzying despite the freezing air around them. But then the ground beneath her own feet shifted. She had not noticed, in the chaos of the rescue, that her frantic pulling had carried her closer and closer to the water's edge, onto a section of ice that had been weakened by the same fractures that had trapped the wolf. The moment her weight settled, a sharp crack split the air, and the world tilted violently beneath her. She had time for one sharp breath before the ice gave way and the river swallowed her whole. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs before she could even scream. Darkness surrounded her, the current dragging her down and sideways all at once, disorienting her so completely that she no longer knew which direction led to the surface. Her limbs, already exhausted from the rescue, refused to respond the way she needed them to. Panic clawed at her chest, but even panic felt distant beneath the crushing weight of the cold. Above the water, the wolf lifted his head. He had barely recovered his own strength when he heard the crack of breaking ice, when he saw the young woman who had saved his life vanish beneath the black surface of the river. Every instinct in his massive body screamed at him to move, to dive back into the water that had nearly killed him only moments before, to repay the debt he now owed with everything he had. He rose on unsteady legs, his fur still dripping, his body still trembling with cold and exhaustion. The spot where she had disappeared was already shifting, the current pulling the broken ice downstream, erasing any clear sign of where she had gone under. He let out a sound then that was not quite a howl and not quite a cry, but something raw and desperate that carried across the frozen valley like a warning bell. It was the sound of an animal calling for help he had no way of summoning fast enough, calling into a storm that did not care whether anyone heard him. Far beyond the ridge, in the great stone halls of the Northern Territory, Alpha King Ronan felt something shift deep inside his chest, a pull he had felt only once before in his life, on the day his bond with his great wolf had first been formed. He straightened from where he stood at the war table, his hand freezing over a map of the border patrols, and his eyes went distant, as though he were listening to something no one else in the room could hear. Ronan, his second in command, a broad-shouldered man named Colin, stepped closer, concern flickering across his face. "What is it?" Ronan did not answer right away. The pull in his chest tightened, sharp and unmistakable, a signal that something was deeply wrong with Voss, the wolf he had been bonded to since childhood, the wolf who was more brother than companion. He had sent Voss out earlier that day to patrol the southern border alone, a routine task Voss had completed 100 times before without incident. But this was not routine. This was fear, and pain, and something that felt disturbingly close to loss. "Gather riders," Ronan said, his voice suddenly hard as stone. "Now, something has happened to Voss." Colin did not question the order. He had served the Alpha King long enough to know that the bond between a king and his great wolf was not something to doubt, not something that could be explained away by ordinary logic. If Ronan said something was wrong, then something was wrong, and every second wasted in questioning it was a second that might cost a life. Within minutes, a dozen riders were saddling their horses in the courtyard, torches blazing against the darkening sky, despite the storm that raged around them. Ronan led them himself, his cloak snapping violently in the wind, his eyes fixed on the southern ridge where he knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than reason, that his wolf was in danger. Back at the river, Voss paced the broken edge of the ice, his massive paws leaving deep prints in the snow, his eyes scanning the dark water for any sign of the young woman who had thrown herself into danger for a creature she had never even met. The current had carried the visible signs of the break downstream, and the storm was worsening by the minute, snow falling so thick now that visibility had shrunk to only a few feet in every direction. He could not simply stand there. Every second she remained beneath that water was a second closer to a fate he refused to accept. Ignoring the exhaustion in his own limbs, ignoring the cold that still clung to his soaked fur like a second skin, Voss began to move along the riverbank, tracking the current, searching for any break in the ice, any sign of movement beneath the surface. He did not know her name. He did not know anything about her except that she had appeared out of the storm, like something sent by fate itself, that she had looked at him with more courage than fear, and that she had given up her own safety, without a moment of hesitation to save a stranger. He would not let that sacrifice be for nothing. The howl that tore from his throat as he ran was different from the one he had made before. It was not a cry for help. It was a promise, echoing across the frozen valley, carried by the wind, toward the riders, who were already racing through the storm toward him, toward the king, who felt his wolf's desperation like a physical wound in his own chest. Somewhere beneath the ice, in the freezing dark of the river, Ilara Whitfield fought against a current that seemed determined to keep her forever, her lungs burning, her mind beginning to slip toward a dangerous, seductive stillness that felt almost like sleep. She thought, in the last clear moment before the darkness closed in completely, that she did not regret it. Whatever happened next, she had saved him. The great silver wolf was alive because of her, and if this was the price of that, then she would pay it without complaint. But fate, it seemed, was not finished with her yet. The current spun Ilara sideways, slamming her shoulder against something hard and unseen beneath the surface. Pain flared bright through the numbness that had begun to spread across her body, and strangely, that pain saved her. It cut through the dangerous calm that had started to settle over her mind, jolting her back into awareness of how close she had come to simply stopping, to letting the water carry her wherever it wanted to go. She would not let it end like this. With whatever strength remained in her limbs, she forced herself to move, kicking against the current instead of fighting it directly, angling her body the way her father had once taught her, when she was a girl learning to swim in the shallow lake behind their cottage. He had told her that panicking in water only made the danger worse, that the trick was to work with the current rather than against it, to find the places where it would carry you toward safety instead of away from it. She had never imagined she would need that lesson to survive a frozen river in the middle of a storm. Her lungs screamed for air, a burning need that overrode every other thought in her mind. She kicked upward, following the faint, distorted light that filtered down through the ice above her, praying it would lead her to open water, rather than another solid, unbreakable surface. Her hand struck something hard, and for one horrifying moment, she thought she had found only more ice, another barrier between herself and the air she desperately needed. Then her fingers found an edge, a broken piece, where the ice had cracked and shifted downstream, leaving a gap just wide enough for her to break through. She surfaced with a violent gasp, cold air rushing into her lungs so suddenly that it felt like fire. The world spun around her, dark and blurred, the storm still raging overhead, snow stinging her face even as she struggled to keep her head above the surface. The current had not released her. It dragged her onward, spinning her in slow, dizzying circles, and every attempt to swim toward the shore was met with resistance that made her arms feel as though they belonged to someone else entirely. Somewhere ahead, through the chaos of the storm, She heard something that gave her a fragile thread of hope. A howl, deep and powerful, closer than she expected, followed by the sound of something enormous crashing through the snow along the riverbank. Voss had found her. He ran alongside the current, his silver-streaked fur soaked and freezing, his massive paws pounding through drifts of snow with a desperation that ignored every ache in his exhausted body. He could see her now, a small dark shape bobbing in the black water, disappearing beneath the surface for terrifying stretches, before reappearing again, each time weaker than before. The river bent sharply ahead, curving around a stand of rocks that jutted out into the water like broken teeth. If she reached that bend without help, the current would either smash her against the stones or pull her under completely, into a deeper channel where no one would ever find her. Voss did not think. He simply acted, throwing himself into the water once more despite every part of his body warning him against it. The cold hit him like a wall, but he pushed through it, powerful legs driving him forward against the current with a strength born of pure will. He reached her just as she was pulled beneath the surface again, and without hesitation, he closed his jaws gently but firmly around the fabric of her cloak, hauling her upward with a force that nearly tore the garment apart. Elara broke the surface coughing violently, water streaming from her hair, her body shaking uncontrollably from the cold. She barely had the strength to grip the fur along Voss's back, but some deep, animal instinct told her exactly what to do, and she clung to him as he fought his way toward the shore, his powerful legs churning against a current that seemed to fight them every step of the way. The rocks loomed closer, dark and jagged, and for a moment it seemed as though the river would win after all, would smash them both against the unforgiving stone before they could reach safety. Voss angled his body at the last possible moment, using every ounce of strength left in his exhausted frame to steer them into a shallow eddy just beside the rocks, where the current slowed enough for his paws to finally find solid ground. He dragged himself and Elara out of the water together, collapsing onto the snowy bank in a tangled heap of fur and frozen fabric, both of them shaking violently, both of them alive against every reasonable expectation. Elara's vision blurred and darkened at the edges. She was aware of the cold in a distant, disconnected way, as though her body had begun to accept a kind of stillness that frightened her more than the river ever had. She tried to speak, to thank the wolf who had saved her twice now in the span of less than an hour, but her lips would not form words, and darkness pulled at the edges of her mind like a patient, waiting friend. Voss pressed his massive body against hers, sharing what little warmth remained in his own soaked fur, refusing to let the cold take what he had fought so hard to save. He let out another howl then, softer than before but no less urgent, a sound meant to carry through the storm to anyone who might be listening, anyone who might come to help before it was too late. Ronan heard it from nearly a mile away, and the sound sent ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the storm. He pushed his horse harder, ignoring the protests of his riders, who struggled to keep pace through the deepening snow, ignoring the branches that whipped against his face and shoulders as he cut a direct path toward the sound. The bond between himself and Voss had grown fainter with every passing minute since he first felt it that evening, a fading warmth that terrified him more than any battle he had ever faced. A bonded wolf and his king shared more than instinct. They shared strength, and if Voss's strength was failing, it meant something had gone terribly wrong. Colin rode close behind him, shouting orders to the other riders to spread out along the riverbank, to search every bend and every shadow for any sign of the missing wolf. The storm made the search brutal, visibility reduced to almost nothing, the howling wind swallowing their calls before they could carry more than a few feet. It was Ronan who found them first. He nearly rode past the shallow eddy entirely, his eyes straining against the snow, before a flash of silver fur caught his attention against the white landscape. He pulled his horse to an abrupt stop and dismounted before the animal had even fully halted, running the last stretch of distance on foot, his heart pounding with a fear he rarely allowed himself to feel. Voss lay curled protectively around a small, still figure, his massive body trembling from exhaustion and cold, his dark eyes lifting toward his king with an expression that carried more emotion than Ronan had ever seen in his loyal companion's gaze. "Voss," Ronan breathed, dropping to his knees beside them both. His hands moved quickly, checking his wolf for injuries, relief, and fear tangling together in his chest, as he took in the full extent of what had clearly been a brutal ordeal. But it was the young woman pressed against Voss's side who drew his full attention once he confirmed his wolf was breathing, exhausted but alive. Her skin had taken on a pale, bluish tint that spoke of dangerous cold, her lips nearly colorless, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. "Who is she?" Ronan asked, though he already suspected the answer would not come easily, not from a wolf who could not speak in this form. Voss let out a low, urgent sound, nudging the young woman gently with his nose, a clear signal that time mattered more than explanations. Ronan understood immediately. Whatever had happened here, whatever debt or bond had formed between his great wolf and this stranger, questions could wait, survival could not. "Colin," he shouted, his voice cutting through the storm with the authority of a man used to being obeyed instantly. "Blankets, now. And clear a path back to the keep, we need to move fast." The riders converged quickly, blankets and cloaks appearing from saddlebags as Ronan carefully lifted Alara into his arms, shocked by how light she felt, how fragile, despite the fierce courage that must have driven her to face a frozen river, for the sake of a wolf she had never met. He wrapped her in layers of fur and wool, pressing her close against his chest, in an attempt to share what warmth he could offer. Voss struggled to his feet beside them, refusing to be left behind, despite his own exhaustion, his eyes never leaving the still form, now cradled in his king's arms. "You saved him," Ronan murmured, more to himself than to the unconscious woman he carried, as he moved quickly toward his waiting horse. "Whoever you are, you saved him, and now we are going to make sure that sacrifice was not made in vain." The ride back to the keep felt endless, the storm showing no mercy as they pushed through drifts of snow that seemed determined to slow their progress. Ronan held Alara close, monitoring the faint rise and fall of her chest, with a focus that bordered on desperate, while Voss ran alongside them, despite his own trembling limbs, refusing every suggestion that he rest or fall back. By the time the great stone gates of the northern keep finally came into view, torches blazing against the darkness, Alara's breathing had grown even shallower, and Ronan knew with a grim certainty that whatever fight remained ahead of her would be far from easy. But she was alive. For now, that would have to be enough. Warmth returned to Alara slowly, like sunlight creeping across frozen ground after a long winter, and with it came the return of awareness. She felt the softness of blankets first, layers of them, heavy and warm against skin that still ached with a deep, bone-level cold. She heard voices before she could make sense of words, low and urgent, moving around her in a room that smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs. When she finally forced her eyes open, the light in the room was dim, lit only by a low fire crackling in a stone hearth and a single candle on a nearby table. She lay in a large bed with carved wooden posts, the kind of furniture that spoke of wealth and status far beyond anything she had ever known in Hollow Pine. Confusion gripped her before memory did, and for a moment she simply stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, trying to understand where she was and how she had gotten there. Then the memory returned in a rush. The river, the wolf, the cold water closing over her head. She sat up too quickly, a wave of dizziness washing over her, and a firm but gentle hand pressed against her shoulder, urging her back down against the pillows. "Easy," a woman's voice said, calm and steady. "You have been through a great deal. Rest a moment before you try to move." Alara blinked until the blurred figure beside the bed resolved into an older woman with silver-streaked hair, pulled back in a practical braid, her sleeves rolled up in the manner of someone accustomed to healing work. Kind eyes studied Alara with a mixture of professional concern and genuine curiosity. "Where am I?" Alara managed, her voice raw and unfamiliar even to her own ears. "You are in the northern keep," the woman answered, reaching for a cup of something warm from the table beside the bed. "My name is Margaret. I serve as healer to the Alpha King's household. You were brought here 2 nights ago, nearly frozen through, after the river nearly claimed your life. 2 nights." Alara struggled to process that information, the sheer amount of time that had passed while she lay unaware of everything around her. "The wolf," she said suddenly, urgency cutting through her confusion. "Is he all right? Is Voss all right?" Margaret's expression shifted into something gentler, almost surprised. "He has not left the corridor outside this room since you arrived. Not once, despite every attempt to convince him to rest properly. I have never seen him behave this way toward anyone before, not even the king himself." Relief flooded through Alara, so intensely that tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. He was alive. He was safe. Whatever price she had paid for that outcome suddenly felt entirely worth it. "Drink this," Margaret said, offering the warm cup. "It will help restore your strength. You lost a great deal of warmth from your body, and it will take time to fully recover, but you are young and strong, and the worst of the danger has passed." Alara accepted the cup gratefully, the warm liquid inside tasting of honey and unfamiliar herbs, soothing the raw ache in her throat. As she drank, the door to the room opened, and a tall figure stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the space with an authority that made Alara straighten instinctively despite her exhaustion. She recognized him instantly, even though she had only glimpsed him briefly through the haze of near unconsciousness at the riverbank. Alpha King Ronan moved with the controlled grace of someone who carried enormous responsibility, his dark eyes sharp and assessing as they settled on her face. "You are awake," he said, and something in his tone suggested this mattered to him more than he perhaps intended to reveal. "That is good news." Alara pulled the blankets higher instinctively, suddenly acutely aware of her own vulnerability. A stranger in unfamiliar surroundings, lying in a bed within the private chambers of a king she had never expected to meet. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I did not mean to intrude on your household. I only wanted to help him." "You saved him," Ronan said, moving further into the room, his gaze never wavering from hers. "There is nothing to apologize for. If anything, it is I who owe you a debt that I do not know how to properly repay." Margaret, sensing the private nature of the conversation forming between them, quietly excused herself, gathering her supplies and slipping from the room with a discreet nod toward the king as she passed. Silence settled over the chamber once she had gone, broken only by the crackling fire and the distant sound of wind against stone walls. Alara found herself studying the king with a curiosity she could not entirely suppress. Stories about the Alpha Kings painted them as distant, powerful figures, more legend than man, but the person standing before her now seemed remarkably human, despite the weight of authority he carried in his posture. "Why did you do it?" Ronan asked finally, pulling a chair closer to the bed and settling into it, his elbows resting on his knees as he studied her intently. "You did not know Voss. You had no reason to risk your life for a wolf you had never met, especially not on a night like that." Alara considered the question carefully before answering. "I heard him crying out," she said. "It did not matter to me who he was or what he meant to anyone else. He was suffering, and I could help, and that felt like enough of a reason." Something shifted in Ronan's expression, an emotion she could not quite name passing briefly across his features, before he schooled them back into careful neutrality. "Not many people would make that choice," he said quietly. "Most would have walked away, told themselves it was too dangerous, that it was not their responsibility." "Perhaps I am simply not very good at walking away," Alara replied, a faint, tired smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite everything. A low scratching sound came from beyond the door, followed by a soft, insistent whine that made Ronan's expression soften immediately. He rose and crossed to the door, opening it to reveal Voss standing in the corridor, his massive form seeming almost too large for the stone hallway, his dark eyes fixed intently past the king toward the bed where Alara lay. "He has been asking to see you," Ronan said, stepping aside to allow the wolf entry. Rather insistently, in fact. Voss padded into the room with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his enormous size, moving carefully around furniture until he reached the side of the bed. He lowered his massive head, pressing his nose gently against Alara's hand where it rested atop the blankets, and let out a low, rumbling sound that carried unmistakable warmth and gratitude. "Hello again," Alara whispered, her fingers moving instinctively to stroke the thick fur along his neck, still faintly damp despite the days that had passed. "I am glad you are all right." Ronan watched the exchange with an expression Alara could not fully read, something contemplative and quietly affected. He had known Voss since childhood, had shared a bond with him deeper than most people could ever understand, and he had never once seen his wolf respond to another person with this kind of open, unguarded warmth. "You have made quite an impression on him," Ronan observed, a note of genuine wonder threading through his words. "He saved my life as well," Alara said, still stroking Voss's fur gently. "The river took me under, after I threw him the rope, and he came back for me. He did not have to do that. he could have simply reached the shore and let me go. Voss does not abandon debts, Ronan said, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the wolf's actions than simple obligation. But I have never known him to fight a current like that one for anyone before, not even for members of our own pack. An awkward, charged silence settled between them, broken finally by Voss himself, who let out a soft, almost impatient sound, and nudged his head firmly against Ronan's leg, as though urging his king toward some conclusion he had not yet reached. Ronan cleared his throat, straightening slightly. "You will stay here until you have fully recovered," he said, his tone shifting back into something more formal, though the softness remained just beneath the surface. "Margaret will see to your care, and you will want for nothing during your recovery. This is the least I can offer, in exchange for what you gave to save my wolf." "That is very generous," Elara said carefully. "But I have a family waiting for me in Hollow Pine. My mother will be worried sick by now, wondering where I have gone." Concern flickered across Ronan's face. "Of course, I will send word immediately, and an escort to bring her here if she wishes to see you, or to reassure her of your safety if she prefers to remain at home. You should not worry about that burden while you are recovering." Elara felt a rush of gratitude at his thoughtfulness, though a small, wary part of her mind wondered exactly what she had stepped into, pulled from a simple life in a quiet village into the private chambers of a powerful king, through nothing more than an impulsive act of compassion, toward a stranger drowning in a frozen river. Over the following days, as her strength slowly returned under Margaret's careful attention, Elara began to learn more about the world she had unexpectedly found herself in. She learned that Ronan's territory encompassed dozens of villages beyond Hollow Pine, all bound together under the protection of the Alpha King and his network of loyal pack members. She learned that Voss was not merely a companion but a bonded partner in the truest sense, sharing a connection with Ronan that went far beyond ordinary friendship, a link forged through ancient tradition and unbreakable loyalty. She also began to notice the way certain members of the household watched her with curiosity, and occasionally with something closer to suspicion. A stranger from a small village, suddenly welcomed into the private quarters of the king's keep, tending to a bond with the great wolf that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, was bound to draw attention, not all of it kind. Colin, the broad-shouldered second-in-command she had glimpsed briefly during her rescue, made a point of visiting her chambers on the third day of her recovery, his expression carefully polite, but his eyes assessing, in a way that made Elara feel as though she were being quietly evaluated. "You have caused quite a stir," Colin said, settling into the chair Ronan had occupied days before, his tone light but his gaze sharp. "Voss has not left your side willingly in 3 days. Ronan has cancelled 2 council meetings to check on your recovery personally. People are beginning to talk. I did not intend to cause any disruption," Elara said honestly, unease creeping into her voice. "I only wanted to help a creature in danger. I never expected any of this to follow from it." "I believe that," Colin said, and something in his tone suggested he meant it sincerely. "But intention rarely changes consequence. Bonds like the one forming between you and Voss are rare, and rarer still between a great wolf and someone outside the pack entirely. Some will see that as remarkable. Others will see it as a threat to be addressed." A chill that had nothing to do with the lingering cold in her bones settled over Elara at his words. A threat to whom? Colin's expression grew more serious. "There are those within this territory who have long hoped for a stronger alliance between Ronan and certain noble families through marriage, families who would not welcome an unexpected outsider capturing this much attention, this much affection from both the king and his great wolf. I only tell you this so that you understand the position you now find yourself in, whether you sought it or not." Elara absorbed this information with a growing sense of unease, the simple, straightforward act of compassion that had led her here suddenly revealing itself to be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. She had saved a wolf's life out of pure instinct, expecting nothing in return, and now she found herself unwittingly at the center of tensions and rivalries that stretched far beyond anything she understood. That night, as she lay awake staring at the unfamiliar ceiling above her, Voss curled protectively at the foot of her bed, as he had every night since her arrival. Elara found herself wondering, for the first time since the frozen river had nearly claimed her, whether the true danger she faced had only just begun. News of Elara's presence in the keep spread faster than she had anticipated, and within a week, the quiet corridors she had grown accustomed to during her recovery began to feel less like a place of healing and more like a stage upon which she was being carefully watched. She noticed it first in small ways. A servant who lingered a moment too long at her door before hurrying away when noticed, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, the pointed way certain nobles addressed her during meals in the great hall, their questions polite on the surface but sharp underneath, probing for information about her family, her background, her intentions. Margaret noticed her growing discomfort during one of their morning sessions, when Alara had finally recovered enough strength to walk the length of the keep's gardens without assistance. "You must not let their whispers weigh on you too heavily," Margaret said, walking beside her along a stone path lined with frost-covered hedges. "This keep has always been a place where rumor travels faster than truth. It has little to do with you specifically, and everything to do with people who have too much time, and too little to occupy their minds during the long winter months. It is difficult not to feel the weight of it," Alara admitted. "I never intended to become the subject of anyone's speculation. I only wanted to go home to my mother, once I had recovered." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "And will you go home? I mean, once you are strong enough?" The question caught Alara off guard, though she supposed it should not have. She had assumed, without fully examining the assumption, that she would return to Hollow Pine once her recovery was complete, that this strange interlude in the northern keep would end, and her life would resume its familiar, quiet rhythm. But something had shifted since that night at the river, something she could not entirely name. It was not simply the bond she felt with Voss, though that connection had grown stronger and more comfortable with each passing day. It was something in the way Ronan looked at her during their conversations, something careful and searching, as though he too was grappling with feelings he had not expected and did not entirely know how to navigate. "I do not know," Alara admitted honestly. "My life is in Hollow Pine. My mother needs my help with the herb garden, and the villagers rely on us both for remedies when illness comes through. I cannot simply abandon that responsibility." "No one is asking you to abandon anything," Margaret said gently. "But sometimes life presents us with paths we never expected to walk, and it is worth considering them fully before deciding they do not belong to us." Before Alara could respond, the sound of approaching voices drew their attention toward the garden entrance, where a small group of finely dressed nobles had gathered, led by a striking woman with sharp features and an air of practiced elegance that immediately set Alara on edge. "Lady Vivienne," Margaret murmured under her breath, her tone carefully neutral, in a way that told Alara everything she needed to know about the complicated history behind that name. Lady Vivienne approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention wherever she went, her gaze sweeping over Alara with an assessment so thorough it felt almost invasive. "So this is the young woman everyone cannot stop discussing," she said, her voice smooth and pleasant on the surface, though something colder lurked beneath it. "The healer's daughter, who wrestled a great wolf from a frozen river with her bare hands, if the more dramatic accounts are to be believed." "I only threw a rope," Alara said carefully, unwilling to accept credit for anything more heroic than what had actually happened. "Voss did the rest himself." "How admirably modest," Vivienne said, though her smile did not quite reach her eyes. "Ronan has always had a soft spot for humble displays of virtue. It is one of his more predictable qualities." The comment carried an edge Alara could not fully decipher, though the tension radiating from Margaret beside her suggested it was not meant kindly. Before she could formulate a response, Vivienne continued, her tone shifting into something more pointed. "You must understand, this territory has weathered difficult years," Vivienne said. "Ronan carries enormous responsibility, not merely as Alpha King, but as the figure who must eventually secure alliances that protect our people from threats beyond our borders. Sentiment is a lovely thing, but it does not build the kind of strength this territory requires to survive. I have not asked for anything from him," Alara said, keeping her voice steady despite the discomfort building in her chest. "I saved his wolf because it was the right thing to do, not because I sought any position or advantage from it." "Of course not," Vivienne said, her smile widening slightly, though it remained cold. "But intentions rarely matter as much as outcomes, do they? And the outcome, whether you sought it or not, is that you now occupy a great deal of the king's attention that many believe would be better directed toward matters of greater strategic importance." With that, she inclined her head in a gesture of practiced courtesy and continued past them into the garden, her companions trailing behind her like a carefully arranged procession. Elara let out a slow breath once they had passed, her hands trembling slightly with an emotion she could not quite name, part anger and part uncertainty. "Do not let her words settle too deeply," Margaret said quietly, though her own expression remained tight with concern. "Lady Vivian has long hoped for a formal alliance between her family and the king's household. She has invested considerable effort into that ambition, and she does not take kindly to anything that appears to threaten it." "I have no interest in threatening anyone's ambitions," Elara said, frustration creeping into her voice, despite her efforts to remain calm. "I simply want to heal and return home to my family." Margaret studied her for a long moment, before speaking again, her tone gentle but honest. "Perhaps that is true, but you should know that Ronan has not spoken of arranging any formal alliance since your arrival, despite considerable pressure from certain corners of his council to do so. Whatever your intentions may be, your presence here has already changed something, whether either of you fully acknowledges it yet." That evening, as Elara sat by the fire in her chambers, with Voss curled contentedly at her feet, she found herself replaying the conversation with Lady Vivian over and over, searching for some way to make sense of the tangled web of politics and expectation she had unwittingly stumbled into. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and she found Ronan standing in the corridor when she opened it, his expression carrying a weariness she had not seen from him before. "May I come in?" he asked. "I heard about your encounter with Lady Vivian this afternoon, and I wanted to speak with you directly, rather than allowing rumor to shape your understanding of the situation." Elara stepped aside to allow him entry, and he settled into the chair by the fire, while Voss lifted his head briefly to acknowledge his king, before resting it once more against Elara's feet, clearly unbothered by the visit. "I am sorry for what she said to you," Ronan began, his voice low and sincere. "Vivian has strong opinions about matters that she believes fall within her sphere of influence, and she does not always express them with the tact the situation requires. She is not entirely wrong," Elara said, staring into the flickering flames, rather than meeting his eyes directly. "I am a healer's daughter from a small village with no title, no wealth, and no strategic value to offer your territory. Whatever attention my presence here has drawn, it likely does complicate matters that deserve careful, practical consideration." "Perhaps," Ronan said, and something in his tone made her finally look up at him. "But I have spent my entire life making decisions based on strategy and practicality, weighing every choice against the needs of my people and the stability of my territory. I have rarely allowed myself to consider what I actually wanted, separate from what seemed most useful." He paused, his gaze steady and searching as it met hers. "Since the night I found you and Voss at that river, I find myself thinking of very little else beyond your safety and your well-being. That is not something strategy alone can explain." Elara's heart pounded at his words, a confusing tangle of hope and caution rising within her. "Ronan, I do not know what to make of any of this. A week ago, my life was simple. I gathered herbs and helped my mother tend to the sick in our village. I never imagined finding myself here, in a position that seems to threaten alliances and provoke the anger of powerful families. I am not asking you to make sense of it tonight," Ronan said gently. "I only wanted you to know that whatever pressure you feel from Vivian, or anyone else within these walls, it does not reflect my own feelings on the matter. You are welcome here, for as long as you wish to stay, and you owe no one an explanation for the bond that is formed between yourself and Voss, or for anything else that might grow from it." Voss let out a soft, approving sound at his king's words, nuzzling closer against Elara's side, as though offering his own quiet endorsement of the sentiment. Despite the warmth of Ronan's words, a lingering unease remained in Elara's chest, as she bid him good night, and settled into bed once he had gone. Lady Vivian's cold smile and pointed words replayed in her mind, a clear warning that whatever comfort she found within the walls of the keep, powerful forces beyond her control were already maneuvering against her, and she suspected this was only the beginning of a much larger struggle she had never asked to be part of. Word arrived from Hollow Pine 3 days later, carried by one of Ronan's fastest riders through the last remnants of the winter storm that had finally begun to loosen its grip on the Northern Territory. Elara's mother, a practical and steady woman named Beatrice, had accepted the king's invitation to visit the keep, though the letter she sent ahead made clear that her primary concern was seeing her daughter's recovery with her own eyes, rather than any interest in the politics swirling around the household. Alara waited in the courtyard on the morning of her mother's arrival, wrapped warmly against the lingering cold, her heart full of a nervous excitement she had not expected to feel so intensely. Voss stood beside her, uncharacteristically restless, pacing small circles as though he too sensed the significance of the moment. When the small caravan finally appeared through the gates, Alara did not wait for proper ceremony. She ran forward the moment she recognized her mother's familiar figure descending from the carriage, and Beatrice met her halfway, pulling her into an embrace so fierce it nearly stole the breath from Alara's lungs. "I thought I had lost you," Beatrice whispered against her daughter's hair, her voice thick with emotion she rarely allowed herself to show so openly. "When the messenger first arrived, saying you had nearly drowned, I feared the worst, until I read further, and learned you had survived." "I am all right, Mother," Alara said, holding her tightly. "I promise you, I am all right." Beatrice pulled back to study her daughter's face, her sharp, practical eyes assessing her health with the same careful attention she had always brought to her healing work. Satisfied that Alara did indeed appear well, color restored to her cheeks, and strength evident in her posture, Beatrice allowed herself a small, relieved smile, before her gaze shifted to the enormous wolf standing patiently a short distance away. "So this is the creature who caused all this trouble," Beatrice said, though her tone carried more warmth than accusation, as she studied Voss with open curiosity. "He did not cause the trouble, Mother," Alara said. "He needed help, and I gave it. That is all that happened." "That is rarely all that happens when a king's great wolf becomes involved," Beatrice said knowingly, though she softened the observation with a gentle smile. "But I can see he cares for you deeply. That much is obvious even from a distance." Over the following days, Beatrice settled into the rhythm of the keep with the same practical steadiness that had always defined her, offering her own knowledge of herbal remedies to Margaret's collection, and quietly observing the dynamics unfolding around her daughter, with the sharp perception of a mother who missed very little. She noticed the way Ronan's expression softened whenever Alara entered a room. She noticed the careful attention the king paid to Alara's well-being, attention that went well beyond what gratitude alone would require. And she noticed, with growing concern, the pointed looks and whispered conversations that followed her daughter through the corridors, courtesy of Lady Vivian and her circle of supporters within the household. "You must be careful here," Beatrice said one evening, as she and Alara sat together in the gardens, watching the last light of sunset fade behind the distant mountains. "I have lived long enough to recognize when powerful people feel threatened, and I do not like the way certain individuals within this keep look at you." "I know, Mother," Alara said, sighing softly. "Lady Vivian has made her feelings on the matter quite clear already." "It is more than feelings," Beatrice said, her voice dropping lower, more serious. "I overheard 2 servants discussing rumors that Vivian has been meeting privately with members of the council, pressing for some kind of formal arrangement to be settled before the spring gathering. They spoke as though time is running short, as though something significant is being planned." A chill settled over Alara, despite the relative warmth of the evening air. "What kind of arrangement?" "I do not know the specifics," Beatrice admitted. "But I would advise caution, my dear. Whatever bond has formed between you and this king, and whatever affection I can see growing in his eyes when he looks at you, there are people within these walls who will not simply accept that bond without a fight." Alara's growing unease found confirmation only 2 days later, when she overheard a conversation she was never meant to witness. She had gone to the keep's library in search of a book on herbal remedies that Margaret had recommended, moving quietly through the tall shelves of leather-bound volumes in the late afternoon light. She had nearly reached the section she sought when the sound of voices drifted from an adjoining alcove, low and urgent, unmistakably belonging to Lady Vivian, and a man Alara recognized as one of the senior council members. "The spring gathering approaches faster than we anticipated," Vivian was saying, her voice tight with impatience. "If Ronan does not commit to a formal alliance before then, our position within the council will weaken considerably. The neighboring territories are already watching, waiting to see whether our leadership remains stable enough to warrant continued respect." "The king has shown no interest in discussing alliance matters since the girl arrived," the council member replied, his tone equally frustrated. "His attention has been entirely consumed by her recovery, and by whatever bond has formed between her and Voss. It is becoming a genuine liability. Then perhaps, Vivian said, her voice dropping into something colder and more calculated, it is time we remind everyone, including the king, exactly how liabilities are handled within this territory. A healer's daughter with no title and no strategic value cannot be allowed to derail matters of such importance. If she will not remove herself from this situation willingly, then other arrangements may need to be considered. Elara's breath caught in her throat, cold dread spreading through her chest at the implication buried within Vivian's carefully measured words. She remained frozen in place among the shelves, straining to hear more, but the conversation shifted to quieter, more guarded tones that she could no longer make out clearly. When she finally slipped away from the library, her mind raced through everything she had just heard, weighing the danger of the vague threat against her own uncertainty about how seriously to take it. She considered saying nothing at all, dismissing the conversation as empty political posturing, born from frustration, rather than genuine intent. But the cold certainty in Vivian's voice lingered in her memory, refusing to be easily dismissed. She found Ronan later that evening in his private study, poring over documents by candlelight, his expression tired but focused as he reviewed reports from various corners of his territory. He looked up immediately when she entered, his tired features brightening slightly at the sight of her. "Elara," he said, setting aside his work. "Is something wrong? You look troubled." She hesitated, uncertain how to broach the subject without seeming paranoid or overly dramatic, but the memory of Vivian's cold words pushed her forward. "I overheard something today," she said carefully. "In the library. Lady Vivian was speaking with one of your council members about the spring gathering, and about the need for you to commit to a formal alliance soon." Ronan's expression grew guarded, though he gestured for her to continue. "She spoke of me as a liability," Elara continued, choosing her words carefully. "She said that if I would not remove myself from this situation willingly, other arrangements might need to be considered. I do not know exactly what she meant by that, but it frightened me." Ronan's jaw tightened visibly, a flash of something sharp and protective crossing his features. "She said that explicitly?" "Not in so many words," Elara admitted, "but the meaning seemed clear enough." Ronan rose from his desk, pacing a few steps as he processed her words, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "Vivian has ambitions that extend well beyond simple political influence," he said finally. "Her family has long sought a formal marriage alliance with mine, believing it would strengthen both our territories against outside threats. I have resisted committing to any such arrangement, in part because I have never felt the kind of connection with Vivian that such a marriage would require, and in part because I have grown increasingly certain that my heart already belongs elsewhere." He turned to face her directly, his expression earnest and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen from him. "I will speak with her directly about this. Whatever frustration she feels toward the current situation, threats against your safety will not be tolerated within this territory, regardless of her family's influence or ambitions." "I do not wish to cause conflict within your household," Elara said, though relief at his firm response eased some of the tension in her chest. "You have caused no conflict," Ronan said gently, closing the distance between them. "You have simply existed as yourself, with courage and compassion that drew my attention and my wolf's loyalty entirely on their own merit. Any conflict that follows belongs to those who cannot accept that outcome gracefully, not to you." Voss, who had been resting quietly near the fireplace throughout their conversation, lifted his head and let out a low, supportive sound, as though adding his own agreement to his king's words. Despite Ronan's reassurance, Elara found sleep elusive that night, her mind circling endlessly around Vivian's veiled threat and the uncertain path that now stretched ahead of her. She had come to the northern keep seeking nothing more than recovery from a near-fatal accident, and instead she had found herself entangled in a web of political ambition and rivalry that threatened to grow far more dangerous before it resolved. As she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, Voss curled protectively at the foot of her bed as always. She could not shake the feeling that Lady Vivian's cold, calculated words had been more than empty frustration. They had been a promise, and promises like that, she suspected, were rarely left unfulfilled without a fight. The days that followed passed with a tense, watchful quality that made even the keep's familiar corridors feel unfamiliar and uncertain. Ronan had spoken with Lady Vivian directly, as he promised, though the conversation had done little to ease the underlying tension that now permeated the household. Vivienne remained outwardly polite whenever their paths crossed, her smiles as practiced and cold as ever, but Ilara could not shake the feeling that something dangerous continued to simmer just beneath the surface. Beatrice, ever practical, insisted on extending her stay beyond her original plans, unwilling to leave her daughter alone in a household where such tensions clearly still lingered. Margaret, too, seemed to keep a closer watch over Ilara during their daily walks through the gardens, her usually calm demeanor carrying a subtle edge of vigilance that had not been present before. It was during one such walk, nearly a week after the overheard conversation in the library, that the danger Ilara had feared finally revealed itself. She and Margaret had ventured slightly further into the keep's extensive grounds than usual, drawn by Margaret's desire to collect a particular winter herb known to grow near the old stone wall marking the eastern boundary of the property. Voss, who typically accompanied Ilara on every outing, had been called away that morning by Ronan for an urgent matter involving border patrols, leaving Ilara without her usual protective companion for the first time since her arrival. The path along the eastern wall was quieter than the main gardens, shadowed by tall, bare trees whose branches created a lattice of shifting shadows across the frozen ground. Margaret moved ahead slightly, her attention focused on identifying the specific herb she sought among the frost-covered undergrowth, while Ilara trailed a short distance behind, lost in her own thoughts about the uncertain path her life had taken. She did not hear the approach until it was almost too late. A sharp, sudden movement in her peripheral vision was her only warning before a hand closed roughly around her arm, yanking her off the path and into the shadow of the trees with startling force. She opened her mouth to cry out, but a second hand clamped firmly over her lips, muffling the sound before it could fully form. Panic surged through her, sharp and immediate, as she struggled against the grip holding her, her mind racing to process what was happening, even as her body fought instinctively for freedom. The man holding her was strong, his grip unrelenting despite her efforts, and she caught only a brief, terrifying glimpse of his face before he forced her further back into the shadows, away from the path where Margaret still searched for herbs, unaware of what was unfolding only a short distance away. "Quiet now," the man muttered, his voice low and rough, carrying an accent unfamiliar to the Northern Territory. "This will go easier for everyone if you simply cooperate." Ilara's mind raced through possibilities, none of them reassuring. She thought immediately of Vivienne's veiled threat, of the cold certainty in her voice when she spoke of removing liabilities from the situation. Fear gave her a sudden burst of strength, and she twisted violently against the man's grip, managing to loosen his hand just enough to bite down hard against his fingers. He hissed in pain, his grip faltering for a crucial moment, and Ilara used the opportunity to scream, the sound tearing through the quiet garden with desperate urgency. Margaret's head snapped up immediately at the sound, her expression shifting instantly from calm focus to sharp alarm. "Ilara!" she called out, already moving toward the source of the scream, her voice carrying loud enough to alert anyone within earshot throughout the grounds. The man cursed under his breath, clearly having not anticipated resistance strong enough to draw attention so quickly. He tightened his grip once more, attempting to drag Ilara further from the path, but her continued struggling slowed his progress considerably, buying precious seconds that would prove crucial in the moments that followed. A powerful howl split the air, closer than Ilara would have thought possible, given how recently Voss had been called away for other duties. She felt a surge of desperate hope at the familiar sound, and moments later, a massive silver shape burst through the tree line with terrifying speed, closing the distance between them faster than seemed physically possible. The man released her abruptly, stumbling backward in shock as Voss skidded to a halt between them, his powerful frame positioned protectively in front of Ilara, a deep, threatening growl rumbling from his chest as his lips pulled back to reveal sharp teeth. The stranger did not wait to see what would happen next. He turned and fled through the trees with impressive speed, clearly recognizing that whatever advantage he had briefly held was now entirely lost. Voss did not pursue him immediately, his priority clearly remaining with Ilara's safety rather than the man's capture. He turned to her instead, his dark eyes scanning her frantically for any sign of injury, a low, worried whine escaping him as he pressed close against her side. "I am all right," Ilara managed, though her voice trembled visibly, her heart still pounding fiercely from the encounter. "He surprised me, but I am all right." Margaret arrived moments later, breathless from running, her expression a mixture of relief and fierce concern as she took in the scene before her. What happened? Who was that man? I do not know, Elara admitted, still shaking, as the full weight of what had just occurred began to settle over her. He grabbed me from the shadows. I have never seen him before in my life. Word of the attempted abduction spread through the keep with alarming speed, and within the hour, Ronan himself arrived at the scene, his expression darker and more furious than Elara had ever witnessed from him. He examined every detail of the encounter with methodical precision, questioning Margaret and Elara thoroughly, while Colin organized search parties to comb the surrounding grounds and forest for any trace of the intruder. He is gone, Colin reported grimly, upon returning from the initial search. No trace remains beyond some disturbed snow along the eastern boundary. Whoever he was, he clearly planned an escape route in advance. This was not a random attack, Ronan said, his voice tight with barely contained anger, as he paced the length of his study later that evening, Elara seated safely nearby, with Voss pressed protectively against her side. Someone planned this carefully, someone who knew the layout of these grounds well enough to identify a vulnerable moment for an approach. You believe Vivian is responsible, Elara said quietly, giving voice to the suspicion that had been building within her since the moment the danger passed. Ronan's expression grew grim. I do not have proof yet, but the timing and circumstances align too closely with her earlier threats to dismiss as coincidence. I intend to investigate this matter thoroughly, and if I find evidence connecting her to what happened today, there will be serious consequences, regardless of her family's standing within this territory. Beatrice, who had rushed to her daughter's side the moment she heard news of the attack, gripped Elara's hand tightly, her own composure clearly strained by fear for her child's safety. This has gone too far, she said firmly, addressing Ronan directly, with the bluntness that had always characterized her. My daughter came here to recover from a near-fatal accident, not to become a target for political scheming and violence. I must consider whether it remains safe for her to stay within these walls at all. The suggestion sent a sharp pang of distress through Elara, though she understood her mother's concern completely. The thought of leaving the keep now, of abandoning the bond she had formed with Voss, and the connection growing between herself and Ronan, felt like its own kind of loss, even as the danger surrounding her continued to escalate. Ronan turned to face Beatrice directly, his expression earnest despite the anger still simmering beneath his composed exterior. I understand your concern completely, and I would never ask you to compromise your daughter's safety for my own comfort. But I give you my word that I will find whoever is responsible for today's events, and I will ensure Elara's protection with every resource available to me. She will not face this danger alone. Voss let out a low, firm sound of agreement, his body still pressed close against Elara's side, a living testament to the protective instinct that had already saved her life once before, and clearly remained fully committed to doing so again. Beatrice studied Ronan for a long, searching moment, weighing his sincerity against the very real danger her daughter had just faced. Finally, she nodded slowly, though her expression remained guarded. I will trust your word for now, she said. But know this, my daughter's safety comes before any political consideration or personal feeling. If that trust proves misplaced, I will not hesitate to take her from this place entirely. Understood, Ronan said gravely, and agreed. As the household settled into an uneasy quiet that night, extra guards posted throughout the grounds, and Voss refusing to leave Elara's side for even a moment, Elara found herself staring into the darkness of her chambers, the events of the day replaying endlessly in her mind. The frozen river had nearly claimed her life once already. Now it seemed a far more calculated danger had entered the picture, one born not from the indifference of nature, but from the deliberate ambition of someone determined to see her removed from a life she had only just begun to imagine building within these unfamiliar walls. The investigation into the attempted abduction consumed the keep over the following days, with Colin leading a thorough inquiry into every possible lead, while Ronan personally oversaw the questioning of household staff and visiting nobles alike. The atmosphere within the walls grew increasingly tense, whispered conversations, replaced by watchful silence, as everyone waited to see what the investigation might reveal. Elara found herself confined largely to the keep's interior during this period, Voss rarely leaving her side even for necessary duties, his protective instincts heightened by the danger that had so recently threatened her safety. She understood the necessity of the restriction, but the confinement weighed on her nonetheless, a stark reminder of how quickly her circumstances had shifted, from simple recovery to something far more perilous. It was Margaret who brought the first significant development, arriving at Alara's chambers late one evening, with an expression that carried both relief and grave concern in equal measure. "They found something," Margaret said without preamble, settling into the chair beside the fire. One of the stable hands recognized a description of the man from the attack, a hired mercenary known to work for coin, rather than loyalty to any particular household. He was seen meeting privately with someone from Lady Vivian's household 3 days before the incident occurred. Alara's breath caught, the confirmation of her suspicions somehow both expected and shocking at once. "Does that mean Vivian ordered the attack directly?" "It suggests a strong connection," Margaret said carefully. "But proving direct involvement from Vivian herself, rather than simply someone within her household acting independently, remains more complicated. She is far too clever to leave obvious evidence connecting herself personally to something this serious." The uncertainty was maddening, and Alara found herself pacing the length of her chambers after Margaret departed, frustration and fear tangling together in a knot that refused to loosen. Voss watched her with concerned eyes, occasionally nudging her gently, as though trying to offer what comfort he could, through simple physical presence. Ronan arrived shortly after, his expression carrying the same complicated mixture of anger and frustration that had characterized his demeanor throughout the entire investigation. "You have heard about the stable hand's account," he said, more statement than question. "I have," Alara confirmed. "What happens now?" "I have summoned Vivian to answer for the connection directly," Ronan said. "She will not be able to dismiss this development as easily as she has dismissed previous concerns. Whether she confesses outright or continues to deny involvement, the council will see clearly that something serious occurred, and that her household bears at least partial responsibility." The confrontation took place the following morning in the Great Hall, with Ronan seated at the head of the long table, Colin standing at attention nearby, and several senior council members gathered to witness the proceedings. Alara had been invited to attend as well, though she remained seated slightly apart from the main table, Voss stationed protectively at her side. Lady Vivian entered with her usual composed grace, though a careful observer might have noticed the slight tightness around her eyes that suggested tension beneath her practiced calm. She took her seat without hesitation, meeting Ronan's gaze directly as the proceedings began. "I understand you wish to discuss recent events," Vivian said, her tone measured and controlled. "Though I confess, I do not fully understand what connection you believe exists between myself and whatever unfortunate incident occurred in the Eastern Gardens. A man matching the description of your attacker was seen meeting with a member of your household 3 days before the attempted abduction took place," Ronan said, his voice hard and direct, allowing no room for the kind of evasive diplomacy that had characterized previous conversations between them. "I would like an explanation for that connection." Vivian's expression flickered briefly, a shadow of something calculating passing across her features, before her composure reasserted itself. "My household employs a great many people, Ronan. I cannot personally account for every meeting or association each of them might have. If someone within my staff acted independently in some manner, connected to this unfortunate incident, I assure you it was without my knowledge or approval." "That is a convenient explanation," Colin interjected, his tone carrying open skepticism. "Particularly given your own words, overheard directly by Alara herself, discussing the need to remove liabilities from this situation before the spring gathering." A murmur ran through the gathered council members at this revelation, and Vivian's composure cracked slightly for the first time, a flash of genuine anger crossing her features, before she managed to smooth it away once more. "I spoke of political liabilities in the abstract sense," Vivian said, her voice tightening despite her efforts to maintain control. "I never suggested violence or abduction as a solution to any concern I might hold. If someone within my household chose to interpret my frustration in such an extreme manner, that reflects poorly on their judgment, not on any instruction I gave." "Convenient," Ronan repeated, his tone leaving no doubt about his skepticism toward her defense. "Regardless of whether direct instruction can be proven, the connection between your household and this attack is now undeniable to everyone gathered in this room. Given the severity of what occurred, I am formally requesting that you and your household withdraw from the keep until this matter is fully resolved, and that you refrain from any further contact with Alara during that period." The color drained slightly from Vivienne's face at this pronouncement, the true weight of the consequences finally settling in despite her earlier composure. "You would banish me from court over the unsubstantiated actions of a single servant?" she demanded, indignation sharpening her voice. "I would ensure the safety of someone under my protection," Ronan replied evenly, regardless of the political cost that decision might carry. "If you are found to be entirely innocent of any direct involvement once further investigation concludes, you will of course be welcomed back to court in due time. Until then, this arrangement stands as necessary precaution." Vivienne rose from her seat with barely restrained fury, her earlier composure entirely abandoned in the face of this unexpected setback to her ambitions. "You will regret this decision, Ronan," she said, her voice low and sharp. "This territory needs strong alliances to survive the challenges ahead, and sentiment for a village healer's daughter will not shield you from the consequences of weakened political standing." "That remains to be seen," Ronan said calmly, refusing to be baited by her provocation. "But my decision stands. You may gather your household and depart by tomorrow morning." Vivienne swept from the hall without another word, her expression carved from cold fury, leaving behind a heavy, charged silence among those who remained. Once the council had dispersed and the hall had emptied of witnesses, Ronan turned to Alara, his expression softening considerably, as concern replaced the hard authority he had displayed throughout the confrontation. "Are you all right?" he asked. "That could not have been easy to witness." "I am relieved mostly," Alara admitted, though unease still lingered beneath the relief. "But I worry this will not truly end the danger." She did not seem like someone who accepts defeat easily. "You are likely correct," Ronan acknowledged grimly. "I do not believe Vivienne will simply abandon her ambitions because of a temporary setback. We will need to remain vigilant, even with her physically removed from the keep for now." That vigilance proved warranted sooner than either of them anticipated. Only 2 days after Vivienne's departure, a messenger arrived at the keep bearing troubling news from the southern border, where increased activity from a rival territory had been reported with growing frequency. Ronan's attention was pulled immediately toward these developing concerns, forced to divide his focus between the ongoing investigation into the attack on Alara and the emerging threat to his territory's broader security. "I do not like the timing of this," Colin observed during a private meeting with Ronan, Alara present at Ronan's request, given her direct involvement in recent events. Vivienne's family has long maintained connections with the Southern Territories through trade relationships. It would not surprise me if this sudden increase in border tension is somehow connected to her recent humiliation here. "You believe she is retaliating by stirring conflict along our borders?" Ronan asked, his expression grave. "I believe it warrants serious consideration," Colin said carefully. "Whether through direct manipulation or simply through information she might have shared with contacts who would benefit from destabilizing this territory, the timing feels too convenient to dismiss as pure coincidence." Alara listened to this exchange with growing unease, the full scope of the danger surrounding her becoming increasingly clear. What had begun as a simple act of compassion toward a drowning wolf had somehow escalated into a situation with implications far beyond her own personal safety, potentially threatening the stability of an entire territory and the well-being of countless people who called it home. "Perhaps I should leave," Alara said quietly, the words costing her more than she expected as she spoke them aloud. "If my presence here continues to create this much danger and division, perhaps the wisest course would be for me to return to Hollow Pine and allow these tensions to settle on their own." "No," Ronan said immediately, his voice firm and unwavering. "This danger existed within the political fabric of this territory long before you arrived, Alara. Vivienne's ambitions and the tensions along our southern border are not problems you created. They are problems that have simply become more visible because of the courage you showed that night at the river, courage that revealed exactly how fragile and self-serving certain alliances within this territory truly are." Voss added his own emphatic agreement, pressing firmly against Alara's side with a low, insistent sound that left no room for argument. "Whatever challenges lie ahead," Ronan continued, his gaze steady and sincere, "I would rather face them with you here beside me than push you away out of misplaced guilt for dangers that are not truly of your making. If you wish to stay, I want you to know that choice remains entirely yours to make, free from any obligation to protect my political interests, at the cost of your own safety and happiness." The sincerity in his words settled something anxious within Alara's chest, though the broader uncertainty of what lay ahead remained unresolved. She glanced toward Voss, who met her gaze with the same steady loyalty he had shown from the very first moment their paths crossed at the frozen river, and found in that connection a quiet, unshakable confirmation of the choice already forming within her heart. "I will stay," she said finally. "Whatever comes next, I would rather face it here than spend the rest of my life wondering what I walked away from out of fear." Ronan's expression warmed with a relief and gratitude he did not attempt to hide, and even amid the gathering storm of political tension and uncertain danger, that single moment of shared resolve felt like solid ground beneath feet that had spent far too long standing on uncertain, shifting ice. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of unsettling reports from the southern border, each one painting a more troubling picture than the last. Scouts spoke of unfamiliar patrols testing the boundaries of Ronan's territory, of increased activity among neighboring packs who had previously maintained careful neutrality, and of whispered rumors suggesting that someone was actively working to undermine the stability that had held the Northern Territory secure for generations. Ronan spent long hours in council meetings and strategic discussions, his attention divided between the growing external threat and his continued determination to ensure Alara's safety within the keep. Despite the mounting pressure, he made a point of finding time each day to check on her well-being personally, a small but consistent gesture that meant more to her than she fully expressed. Alara, for her part, found herself drawn increasingly into the daily rhythms of life within the keep, no longer simply a guest recovering from injury, but someone who had begun to carve out a genuine place within the household. She spent mornings assisting Margaret with the preparation of herbal remedies, her own knowledge from years helping her mother in Hollow Pine proving genuinely valuable to the keep's healing practices. Afternoons often found her walking the grounds with Voss, their bond continuing to deepen in ways that surprised even those who had witnessed its formation from the very beginning. It was during one such afternoon walk, nearly a month after Vivian's departure from the keep, that the simmering tension along the southern border finally erupted into open danger. The warning came first as a distant sound, a deep, resonant horn call echoing across the valley from the direction of the southern watchtowers, a signal that every member of the household recognized instantly as a call to arms. Voss's entire posture shifted immediately, his ears pricking forward, every muscle in his powerful frame tensing with alert readiness. "Something is wrong," Alara said, though the words felt unnecessary, given the obvious change in Voss's demeanor. Voss let out a sharp, urgent bark, and immediately began ushering her back toward the keep, his body language leaving no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. They had barely reached the main courtyard when Colin came sprinting from the direction of the gates, his expression grim and focused. "Riders approaching from the south," he called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard as household guards scrambled into defensive positions. "Not our own scouts. Unknown numbers, moving fast." Ronan emerged from the main hall moments later, already dressed for battle, his expression hardening into the focused calm of someone who had prepared for exactly this kind of threat, despite hoping it would never materialize. His gaze found Alara immediately across the chaos of the courtyard, and something protective and urgent flashed across his features. "Get her inside," he ordered Colin sharply, before turning his attention to the mobilizing guards. "Seal the inner gates. I want archers positioned along the eastern and western walls immediately. I am not simply going to hide while danger approaches," Alara said, stepping forward despite Colin's attempt to guide her toward the safety of the interior halls. "If there are injuries, Margaret will need help. I can be useful." Ronan's jaw tightened with the familiar tension of someone torn between protective instinct and respect for her agency. "The healing hall, then," he said finally. "Stay there with Margaret, and do not venture beyond it until this threat has been fully addressed. Please, Alara, I cannot focus on defending this territory if I am also worried about your safety in the middle of open conflict." She nodded, understanding the reasonable boundary of his request, even as her own instinct to help pulled her toward wanting to do more. Voss remained torn as well, his loyalty split between protecting Alara directly and standing beside his king during whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Go with him," Alara said gently, placing a hand against Voss's massive head. "He needs you more than I do right now. I will be safe with Margaret." Voss hesitated only a moment longer before turning to follow Ronan toward the gates, though he glanced back once, a clear promise in his dark eyes that he would return the moment circumstances allowed. The healing hall filled quickly with the tense energy of preparation, Margaret directing a small team of assistants as they readied bandages, salves, and other supplies in anticipation of injuries that might result from whatever confrontation was unfolding beyond the walls. Elara threw herself into the work, grateful for the distraction from the fear building steadily in her chest, as the sounds of shouted orders and mobilizing forces echoed from the courtyard beyond. "Do you think it is truly an attack?" one of the younger assistants asked nervously, her hands trembling slightly as she folded clean bandages into neat stacks. "I do not know," Margaret admitted honestly, her own composure remaining steady, despite the uncertainty. "But whatever it is, our task remains the same. We prepare for the worst, and hope fervently for something far less severe." The tense waiting stretched on for what felt like hours, though Elara suspected in truth it was closer to a single hour before the sounds from the courtyard began to shift, the sharp urgency of conflict giving way gradually to something calmer, though still charged with residual tension. Colin appeared at the healing hall entrance eventually, his expression weary but relieved, a testament to a confrontation that had apparently concluded without the catastrophic outcome everyone had feared. "It was a scouting force, not a full assault," he reported to Margaret and the gathered assistants. "They tested our defenses and retreated once they realized how prepared we were. We have injuries, but nothing life-threatening among our own ranks." Relief flooded through Elara at this news, though it remained tempered by the knowledge that this had likely been only the opening move in a larger, more dangerous game. The injured began arriving shortly after, and Elara worked alongside Margaret and the other healers late into the evening, tending to cuts and bruises with practiced efficiency, grateful for the years of training under her mother's guidance that had prepared her well for exactly this kind of demanding work. It was nearly midnight before the flow of patients finally slowed enough for her to step outside briefly, seeking a moment of fresh air after hours spent in the close, herb-scented atmosphere of the healing hall. She found Ronan standing alone near the courtyard wall, his gaze fixed on the distant southern horizon, where faint traces of torchlight still marked the location of retreating enemy forces. "You should be resting," Elara said softly, approaching him carefully. "I could say the same to you," Ronan replied, though a tired smile softened the observation. "Margaret tells me you worked tirelessly all evening, tending to injuries with skill that impressed even her considerable experience." "It felt good to be useful," Elara admitted. "Better than simply waiting helplessly while others faced danger on my behalf." Ronan turned to face her fully, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of exhaustion and something warmer, something that had grown steadily throughout the weeks since her arrival, despite everything working against it. "Colin believes this attack confirms our suspicions about outside interference stirring conflict along our borders," he said. "The tactics used, the timing, all of it points toward deliberate provocation rather than organic escalation between neutral territories." "You believe Vivian is truly connected to this as well," Elara said, though it was more confirmation than question. "I cannot prove it definitively," Ronan admitted, "but the pattern grows increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Whatever the truth of her involvement, this territory now faces genuine danger that extends well beyond any single political rivalry." Voss appeared then, moving across the courtyard toward them, with visible exhaustion in his gait, though his eyes brightened considerably at the sight of Elara safe and unharmed. He pressed close against her side once he reached them, and she wrapped her arms around his massive neck, grateful beyond words that he too had emerged from the confrontation without serious injury. "Whatever comes next," Elara said, looking between Ronan and Voss with quiet determination, "I do not intend to simply wait in safety while both of you face danger on my account, or on this territory's account. If there is a way I can help protect what we are building here, I want to be part of that effort, not merely a bystander hoping for the best outcome." Ronan studied her for a long moment, something fierce and proud flickering behind his tired eyes. "I believe you," he said finally, "and I suspect, given everything I have witnessed since the night you saved Voss from that frozen river, that trying to convince you otherwise would prove entirely futile regardless of my own protective instincts." A faint, Exhausted laugh escaped Alara at this observation, the first genuine moment of levity in what had been an otherwise harrowing day. "You are learning," she said. "Slowly," Ronan agreed, a genuine smile finally breaking through his weariness. "But I am learning." As the three of them stood together beneath the cold night sky, the distant threat of conflict still lingering on the horizon, Ilara felt something solidify within her chest, a resolve that had been building steadily since that fateful night at the river. Whatever dangers still lay ahead, whatever political scheming or open conflict threatened the fragile peace they had all worked so hard to protect, she was no longer simply a healer's daughter caught unexpectedly in circumstances beyond her control. She had become something more, a willing participant in a fight worth having, standing beside a king and his great wolf who had both, in their own ways, chosen her just as fully as she had chosen them. The days following the border skirmish brought a flurry of activity throughout the keep, as Ronan worked tirelessly with Colin and his council to strengthen defenses and gather clearer intelligence about the forces testing their territory's boundaries. Alara found herself increasingly drawn into these discussions, her knowledge of Hollow Pine and the surrounding villages proving unexpectedly valuable when questions arose about the terrain and resources available throughout the region. It was during one such strategy session, nearly 2 weeks after the initial confrontation, that a scout arrived bearing news that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. "We captured one of the enemy scouts attempting to breach our eastern perimeter," the messenger reported, breathless from his hurried journey back to the keep. "He has agreed to speak in exchange for lenient treatment, and what he has revealed confirms our worst suspicions." Ronan's expression sharpened immediately. "Speak plainly. What has he told you?" "Lady Vivian has been in direct communication with the Southern Territory's leadership for weeks," the messenger continued. "She provided detailed information about our defenses, our patrol schedules, and most damning of all, she encouraged them to press forward with escalating provocations, promising that internal division within our own household would leave us vulnerable to a more significant assault in the near future." The revelation landed like a physical blow across the gathered council, confirming with damning clarity what had previously remained only suspicion and circumstantial connection. Ronan's expression darkened considerably, anger and betrayal warring visibly across his features. "Where is Vivian now?" he demanded. "That is the difficulty," Colin interjected grimly. "According to the captured scout, she departed her family estate 3 days ago, apparently intending to meet directly with Southern leadership to finalize whatever arrangement she has been negotiating. If that meeting proceeds as planned, we may be facing a far more organized and significant assault than the scouting expedition we repelled previously." The weight of this news settled heavily over the assembled council, the reality of genuine, organized warfare suddenly feeling far more immediate than the abstract tension that had characterized the preceding weeks. Alara watched Ronan carefully as he absorbed this information, seeing the toll it took on him, even as he worked to maintain the composed authority his position demanded. "We cannot simply wait for that assault to materialize," Ronan said finally, his voice hard with resolve. "If Vivian is meeting with Southern leadership to finalize plans, then intercepting that meeting or disrupting the alliance before it fully solidifies represents our best opportunity to prevent significant conflict. That would mean crossing into contested territory," Colin cautioned. "A risky proposition under the best circumstances, and considerably more dangerous given the current tension along our borders." "I am aware of the risk," Ronan said, "but the alternative, waiting passively while a coordinated assault gathers strength against us, seems considerably more dangerous in the long term." The council debated the proposal at length, weighing various strategies and contingencies late into the evening, until finally a plan began to take shape. A small, carefully selected group would travel toward the border, under cover of darkness, seeking to locate and disrupt the meeting between Vivian and Southern leadership before any formal alliance could be finalized. Ilara listened to the unfolding plan with growing unease, a familiar, restless determination building within her chest as details solidified around her. When the council finally dispersed for the evening, she found Ronan alone in his study once more, reviewing maps of the border region with an intensity that spoke to the weight of responsibility he carried. "I want to come with you," she said, without preamble, stepping into the room. Ronan looked up sharply, immediate refusal evident in his expression before she had even finished speaking. "Absolutely not. This mission carries significant danger, Alara. I will not risk your safety on something this uncertain. You said yourself that you believed trying to convince me to remain passively on the sidelines would prove futile, Alara reminded him, echoing his own words from the courtyard weeks earlier. This threat exists because of choices made in response to my presence here. I do not intend to hide safely within these walls while you and Voss face danger that has grown, at least in part, from circumstances surrounding me. This is different, Ronan insisted, though his voice carried less certainty than before. A border skirmish defended within our own territory is one matter. Traveling directly toward a potential confrontation in contested lands is another entirely. Voss, who had been resting quietly near the fireplace, lifted his head and let out a low, considering sound, his gaze moving between Ronan and Alara, with an expression that seemed to weigh the merits of both perspectives. I have skills that could prove useful, Alara pressed on. My knowledge of herbal remedies could mean the difference between survival and tragedy if injuries occur during this mission, particularly if we are far from the resources available here at the keep, and I refuse to simply wait behind, wondering whether you and Voss will return safely, when I could instead be doing something to help ensure that outcome. Ronan studied her for a long, searching moment, the internal conflict between his protective instincts and his growing respect for her determination, clearly visible in his expression. Finally, he let out a long, resigned breath. If you come, he said slowly, you remain under strict guidance throughout the entire mission. You do not act independently, you do not place yourself in unnecessary danger, and the moment I determine the risk has grown beyond acceptable limits, you agree to withdraw to safety without argument. Agreed, Alara said immediately, relief and determination mingling in her chest. The small party departed under cover of darkness 2 nights later, moving swiftly and quietly through terrain that grew increasingly unfamiliar as they approached the contested border region. Alara rode close to Ronan throughout the journey, Voss ranging ahead and alongside them, his keen senses providing crucial early warning of any potential danger along their path. They reached the outskirts of the meeting location, an abandoned trading post situated in a narrow valley that marked the informal boundary between northern and southern territories, just before dawn, on the second day of travel. Colin, who had scouted ahead with 2 other riders, returned with confirmation that Vivian's party had indeed arrived, along with a significant contingent of southern representatives whose presence suggested the negotiations underway carried serious weight. We need to move carefully, Ronan murmured, studying the layout of the trading post from their concealed position among the surrounding trees. If this negotiation is as far along as we fear, a direct confrontation could easily escalate into exactly the conflict we are trying to prevent. Perhaps a direct confrontation is not the answer, Alara suggested quietly. If Vivian is promising internal division within your household as leverage for this alliance, perhaps demonstrating that such division does not actually exist would undermine her position more effectively than force ever could. Ronan considered this thoughtfully. You are suggesting we approach openly, rather than through subterfuge or confrontation. I am suggesting that showing unity, showing that her claims about weakness and vulnerability are false, might accomplish more than any show of force, Alara said. Southern leadership is presumably considering this alliance because they believe it offers genuine advantage. If that advantage disappears because the division Vivian promised proves illusory, the incentive for conflict diminishes considerably. It was a bold strategy, carrying its own significant risks, but after careful consideration and discussion with Colin, Ronan ultimately agreed that a direct, confident approach might indeed prove more effective than the covert disruption originally planned. They emerged from the tree line as the sun fully rose, Ronan riding at the front of the small party with clear authority and confidence, Voss pacing powerfully at his side, and Alara positioned visibly beside them rather than hidden away as any sign of vulnerability or division might suggest. The reaction within the trading post was immediate and visible, even from a distance, Southern representatives startling at the unexpected arrival, while Vivian's expression, glimpsed briefly through the gathering crowd, shifted rapidly from calculated composure to something far more alarmed. Lady Vivian, Ronan called out as they approached, his voice carrying clearly across the open ground between them, pitched deliberately for maximum effect among the gathered witnesses. I confess I did not expect to find you conducting private negotiations with Southern leadership regarding matters that concern my territory's security. Vivian's composure wavered visibly, though she attempted to recover quickly. Ronan, this is simply diplomatic outreach, nothing more sinister than ensuring stable relations between neighboring territories. Diplomatic outreach that included sharing detailed information about our defenses and patrol schedules? Ronan replied evenly, his tone carrying an edge that left no room for further deception. Information that a captured scout has already confirmed came directly from your household. A murmur rippled through the gathered Southern representatives, clearly uncomfortable with this public revelation of the true nature behind their supposed negotiations. Vivian's expression grew increasingly desperate, recognizing the collapse of her carefully constructed plan unfolding in real time before an audience she had never intended to witness this confrontation. You promised us internal weakness, one of the Southern leaders said, addressing Vivian directly with obvious suspicion. Division that would leave the Northern Territory vulnerable. Yet here stands your Alpha King, his great wolf, and the very woman whose presence you claimed had created such fracture within his household, all presenting a remarkably unified front. This changes our calculations considerably, another Southern representative added, exchanging a meaningful glance with his colleagues. We came prepared to negotiate advantage born from genuine weakness, not to become entangled in personal political schemes that offer us little actual benefit. Vivian's carefully constructed alliance began crumbling visibly before everyone's eyes, Southern leadership recognizing quickly that the foundation of promised weakness upon which the entire negotiation had been built simply did not exist in the manner she had described. Ronan pressed the advantage further, his voice steady and commanding as he addressed the Southern representatives directly. My territory remains strong, unified, and fully capable of defending itself against any threat, external or internally manufactured, through the ambitions of a single, misguided noble family. I would welcome genuine diplomatic relations, built on honest mutual benefit, but I will not tolerate manipulation or manufactured conflict born from someone's personal grievances. The Southern leadership conferred quietly among themselves for several tense moments before their apparent leader stepped forward, addressing Ronan with a formal bow that carried clear diplomatic significance. It seems we have been presented with a distorted picture of the true situation within your territory. We have no interest in pursuing conflict on the basis of false pretenses. Consider our discussions with Lady Vivian concluded, and we extend our willingness to establish proper diplomatic channels through legitimate means going forward. Vivian stood frozen amid the wreckage of her carefully laid plans, her expression a complicated mixture of fury and dawning realization that her ambitions had not merely failed, but had been thoroughly and publicly exposed before witnesses who now viewed her with clear distrust, rather than the respect she had once commanded. This is not over, she hissed, though the threat carried considerably less weight now that her scheme had unraveled so completely, before an audience that had witnessed every stage of her downfall. I believe it is, Ronan replied calmly, though firm resolve underlaid his measured tone. You will return to the keep with us, Lady Vivian, where you will formally answer for your role in coordinating an attack against Alara, and for the treasonous communication of sensitive territorial information to a foreign power. Whatever consequences follow will be determined through proper council proceedings, but your ability to continue undermining this territory's stability from within ends today. Colin moved forward to ensure Vivian's compliance, and as the small party began their return journey toward the keep, Southern representatives departing in the opposite direction, with considerably more caution and respect than they had shown upon initial encounter, Alara felt the tension that had gripped her chest for weeks finally begin to loosen its hold. The danger was not entirely resolved, she understood. Political consequences and formal proceedings still lay ahead, and the broader challenge of rebuilding trust and stability within the territory would take considerable time and effort. But the immediate threat, the carefully orchestrated scheme that had nearly torn apart everything Ronan had worked to protect, had finally been exposed and dismantled. Voss moved close beside her as they rode, his warm presence a comforting reminder of everything that had brought them to this moment, from a desperate cry across a frozen river to a confrontation that had ultimately proven the strength of bonds forged through genuine loyalty rather than political calculation. You were remarkable back there, Ronan said quietly, drawing his horse alongside hers as they continued their journey homeward. Your suggestion to approach openly, rather than through subterfuge, made all the difference in how this confrontation unfolded. We were remarkable, Elara corrected gently, glancing between him and Voss with quiet affection. All three of us, together. That is what truly undermined Vivian's entire scheme. She counted on division, and instead, she found unity she never anticipated. Ronan reached across the space between their horses, taking her hand gently in his own, a simple gesture that carried significant weight after everything they had endured together. Whatever challenges remain ahead, he said softly, I find myself increasingly certain that facing them beside you, rather than for the sake of political convenience alone, is exactly where I wish to remain. As the keep's familiar towers finally came into view on the horizon, promising rest and safety after the tension of recent days, Elara allowed herself, for the first time since that fateful night at the frozen river, to imagine a future that extended well beyond mere survival, towards something that felt genuinely, hopefully like belonging. The formal council proceedings against Lady Vivian convened 3 days after their return to the keep, a solemn affair, conducted before the full assembly of Ronan's advisors and senior household members. Elara attended alongside Beatrice, who had remained at the keep throughout the entire ordeal, her practical steadiness a source of comfort during the tense days of uncertainty. Vivian stood before the council with none of her previous composure, the weight of undeniable evidence, corroborated testimony from the captured scout, and the public humiliation of her failed alliance, leaving little room for the confident denials she had offered in earlier confrontations. Ultimately, the council determined that her actions, while severe, stemmed from misguided ambition rather than deeper malice, and her sentence reflected that distinction: permanent exile from the Northern Territory and formal severance of her family's political standing within the council, rather than more severe punishment that might have been warranted under different circumstances. As Vivian departed the keep for the final time, her expression carefully blank despite the obvious weight of her fall from influence, Elara felt an unexpected pang of something close to sympathy, quickly tempered by the memory of genuine danger her scheming had created. "Do you feel any regret over the outcome?" Margaret asked her later that day, as they worked together in the healing hall, preparing supplies that had been depleted during recent events. "Not for the consequences she faced," Elara said thoughtfully, "but perhaps some regret that ambition and fear drove her towards such destructive choices, rather than towards something more constructive. I understand wanting security and stability. I simply wish she had pursued it differently." "That compassion speaks well of you," Margaret said with a warm smile, "though I suspect it will serve you well in whatever role you choose to embrace here going forward." The question of what exactly that role might become had grown increasingly clear over the weeks that followed, as the immediate crisis resolved into a more settled, hopeful rhythm within the keep. Ronan's attention, no longer consumed by the dual threats of political scheming and border conflict, turned increasingly toward matters closer to his heart, and toward the woman who had transformed his life so unexpectedly, since the night she threw a single rescue rope across a frozen river. He found her one evening in the gardens where they had first walked together during her recovery, the same stone paths now dusted with the early green shoots of approaching spring, rather than the harsh frost that had characterized their earlier encounters. Voss trailed a respectful distance behind him, seeming to sense the significance of the moment even before Ronan spoke. "I have been thinking," Ronan said, settling onto the stone bench beside her, "about everything that has happened since that storm brought you into our lives. About how something as simple as compassion for a suffering stranger has reshaped not only my own path, but the stability of this entire territory." "It feels like a lifetime ago," Elara admitted, "though it has been barely 2 months since that night at the river." "I have also been thinking," Ronan continued, his voice carrying a nervousness that seemed at odds with the confident authority she had grown accustomed to seeing from him, "about what comes next, about whether the connection that has grown between us, and between you and Voss, might become something more permanent than a temporary arrangement born from circumstance and gratitude." Elara's heart quickened, understanding the direction of his words even before he finished speaking them. "What are you asking, Ronan?" He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands gently in his own, his expression earnest and unguarded in a way that left no doubt about the sincerity behind his words. "I am asking whether you would consider making a life here, permanently, not as a guest recovering from injury, or as a stranger caught in political circumstance, but as someone who belongs here, as fully and completely as anyone within these walls." I am asking whether you might consider becoming my wife and ruling this territory beside me, not out of political necessity as Vivian once envisioned, but out of genuine partnership and love that has grown between us, despite every obstacle placed in our path." Voss let out a soft, encouraging sound from where he sat nearby, his dark eyes bright with obvious approval of the question being posed. Tears gathered unexpectedly in Alara's eyes, joy and overwhelming emotion mingling together, as she considered the remarkable journey that had brought her to this exact moment. She thought of the frozen river, of the desperate cry that had pulled her from a familiar, quiet life into danger and uncertainty. She thought of Voss's loyal companionship, of Margaret's warm guidance, of her mother's protective love throughout every challenge they had faced together. And she thought of Ronan himself, of the genuine partnership and respect that had grown steadily between them despite every political obstacle that had sought to keep them apart. "Yes," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion but absolutely certain. "Yes, I will stay. Yes, I will build a life here with you, and with Voss, for as long as fate allows us that privilege." Ronan's answering smile held all the warmth and relief of a man who had genuinely feared her answer might differ, and he pulled her into an embrace that Voss quickly joined, pressing his massive body close against them both, with a happiness that needed no words to express. The announcement of their engagement spread through the Northern Territory with considerably more joy and celebration than the earlier tensions surrounding Vivian's schemes had ever inspired. Villages throughout the region, including Hollow Pine itself, celebrated the news of a healer's daughter who had shown such remarkable courage and compassion that she had won not only the loyalty of a great wolf, but the heart of their alpha king as well. Beatrice, upon hearing the news, embraced her daughter with tears of joy openly streaming down her face, all earlier caution and protective concern giving way fully to genuine happiness at the remarkable path her daughter's life had taken. "I always knew you were capable of remarkable things," she said, holding Alara close. "I simply never imagined they would lead you quite this far from our quiet life in Hollow Pine. Some paths reveal themselves only when we have the courage to follow where compassion leads," Alara replied, echoing sentiments that had guided her through every difficult choice since that fateful night at the river. The wedding took place as spring fully bloomed across the Northern Territory, wildflowers carpeting the same gardens where Ronan had first begun to fall, for the courageous young woman who had saved his wolf, and by extension, so much more than either of them could have initially imagined. Voss stood proudly beside them throughout the ceremony, his presence a living symbol of the bond that had brought them all together, forged not through political calculation or convenient circumstance, but through genuine courage, loyalty, and the kind of love that grows strongest when tested by real adversity. As the ceremony concluded and celebration filled the keep long into the warm spring evening, Alara found a quiet moment to step away from the festivities, walking once more toward the edge of the property, where, months earlier, a frozen river had nearly claimed her life, in the act of saving a stranger she had never expected to matter so deeply to her future. The river flowed freely now, ice long since melted away, its waters calm and clear beneath the gentle spring sky. Voss joined her there, settling beside her with the same quiet, steady presence that had characterized their bond from its very first moment. "We came a long way from that night," Alara said softly, resting her hand against his familiar, warm fur. Voss let out a low, contented sound, and somewhere behind them, she heard Ronan's approaching footsteps, his own presence joining theirs beside the water that had once threatened everything and had instead become the beginning of everything that truly mattered. She had given a rope to a drowning wolf on the coldest night of her life, expecting nothing in return beyond the simple satisfaction of having done what compassion demanded. In return, she had found a family, a purpose, and a love that had proven strong enough to weather every storm that fate and ambition had thrown against it. The frozen river had nearly claimed her that night, but in the end, it had given her so much more than it had ever threatened to take away.